into the arts and policy and education, which can bring us together, and how these different areas of pushing forward sustainability can work together to advance sustainability education, not only in the Phoenix region, but beyond. So I am going to go ahead and kick it off to passing it on to our panelists. We have the wonderful Marisol, Joetta, and Sayochna here in person with us, and Angela online. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it off. If you could just introduce yourselves, panelists, tell us a little about the work you're doing with education, with activism, with art, and what you're bringing to the table from your respective areas for sustainability education.
My name is Marisol Garcia. I'm the current president of the Arizona Education Association. We're the largest labor union in the state. I'm a veteran 8th grade educator out of the Isaac School District. One of my students just left. She was here for the earlier panel watching. I also am really excited about this new generation and conversations outside of our normal bubble about what education could look like. I come forward as the first woman of color to lead this organization with an excitement of knowing that there's opportunities to involve new people in discussions about what education could look like, ensuring that we can, serve all of our students and the issues that they think are important and help them onto their next step, whatever that may be.
Hi, my name is Joetta Gonzalez, and first off, I'm a mom, I'm a nana, I'm a wife, and I'm a daughter to a mother who has Alzheimer's disease. That's a little bit about me personally. Professionally, I am a clinical professor at the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College, and I work in educational leadership. We're preparing the future principals, superintendents, and other district leaders and school leaders across the state. Before becoming, before taking on this role as clinical professor, I served as superintendent of the Casa Grande Elementary School District and also worked in several districts, including Tempe, where I met Anne, as a principal, as a teacher. And my mom was a teacher. My oldest daughter is a teacher. And so teaching and education just kind of runs in my blood. It's something that I love, and it's something that I always want to be connected to. And it's a pleasure to be here today.
Hi everyone, my name is Sayochna Dura. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm super honored to be here on this panel with all of you. I currently work with this initiative called Turn It Around, Flashcards for Education Futures, where we work to communicate the artistic visions of young people in the realms of climate education and environmental policy. So a lot of my work is around connecting with young people, elevating their voices, and making sure that they believe that they have a space and a home in the climate movement. Additionally, I work in policymaking, advocacy through my role with the United Nations Ocean Decade as their policy co-chair for the U.S. Youth Advisory Council, where I advise Congress on passing climate bills around the ocean and climate justice. And additionally, I work in climate education with my work with One Up Action International, where I work in developing international programs that educate young people around developing climate solutions. So a lot of my work is around uplifting youth voices and supporting them in advocacy.
And I'll pass it to Angela now, if you could introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Hello? Okay, perfect. Great to hear you guys. And my name is Angela. I'm so thankful to be on this panel with some amazing, inspiring people. And I am a student at Harvard. I study economics and environmental policy. I am a board member for the Climate Initiative, which is a nonprofit based in the US that works to provide educational material on climate change to teachers around the world. Outside of that, I also previously served as campus minister for climate education and hope to continue to work in sustainability long term on US-China climate negotiations. And that's really driven a lot of my interest in climate education overall as someone who's currently a student. So really interested to hear what everyone has to say. And thanks again so much for having me here.
Panelists, for introducing yourself. So to start off this discussion, and this will be a little more informal of discussion, we're hoping our panelists can not only have a conversation amongst themselves, but with you in the audience as well. So please take notes, have questions. We really want to involve you in this discussion. But to start, in your respective areas, working with education, working with art, working with activism, how can you use those methods to push forward action for climate, for positive climate futures, for sustainability, for inclusiveness, for diversity? How can you bring that all together, and not only in your own respective field, but collaborating with each other across these different areas?
I can speak a little bit about our organization or the union on a statewide level, as well as our affiliate on a national level. Being able to be part of discussions on creating standards, right? What we present in the classroom, if we ensuring that we're able to give students the tools to express themselves, identify issues, and then put that kind of work into actual change. That is really what my core job is as an 8th grade teacher, teaching critical thinking skills, is that I want to be able for students to find something that they are passionate about, give them the skills to then present it, talk about it, make change, become an activist. Part of the reason why I became so involved in labor and union work is because I saw that as an avenue for me to be able to make changes that needed to happen in my classroom, changes that needed to happen in my community, and furthermore, changes that I think needed to happen in this state. So there was a call to activism that allowed my students to see me do that. That is something that was extremely powerful for my students, to be able to see their educator going out there. So it's twofold: at my actual profession that I was able to do within the classroom, and then outside of that. So, and it is a principled step, and it is difficult when you're working in a profession that has for a very long time been disrespected and not treated fairly, and to some extent has been exploited. It is a difficult step, and it is hard for educators to do that. But the ones who are able to really get in there and do the work are able to model what it could look like for their students.
Me, I believe that art holds the powerful ability to transform the world. And I believe that art holds a very powerful place in the climate movement. Oftentimes, when we think about solving climate change, we sometimes think about it technically. We think that we only need the policymakers and the scientists on board to solve this crisis. But I truly believe that we need every single sector of society on board. And I believe that art holds the ability to connect those sectors of society. Art allows people to connect beyond languages, beyond ideas, and beyond belief systems to truly understand what we need to do to solve the crisis and understand each other's stories. Through the work I've done in artwork, I've seen the ability for art to tell the stories of individuals, especially from vulnerable communities with their experiences of climate change, and truly allow them to transcend boundaries and allow policymakers in different sectors of society and different stakeholders to understand their stories and their experiences. And in climate education, I believe that art also holds a powerful place in that too, because we need to radically reimagine the way we approach education. And I believe that we need all the visionaries on board, and a lot of artists are visionaries. So we've developed curriculum around climate change using artwork and poetry, and art has truly kind of like transformed the way we've seen the climate crisis by allowing people to think creatively and also connect beyond borders.
I think I can piggyback on the idea of radically reimagining education, because that's something that we ask our future principals, our future superintendents to do. We know that we've been doing this work for a long time, and we've been doing it in very similar ways for a little over 200 years. And so it is time to think about our purpose. And part of our purpose is in creating a democracy, or pluralistic democracy, that's sustainable. But it's also about taking care of one another. Leadership is not about being in charge, but it's taking care of others in your charge. So it's looking at the people that we serve, our kids, our teachers, our families, and more importantly, it's looking at the ways in which we interact with them and encourage them to think critically, to think artistically, to think in ways that help them communicate and take care of the earth. In all of those ways, we're really trying to help prepare principals and other district leaders who are strategically thinking about the ways that they take care of one another, take care of the teachers and students that attend their schools, but take care of the planet in which their school belongs. A really important thing for sure. And part of that also involves ensuring that we are taking care of the whole child, and the whole child involves their artistic expression, and there's certainly room for whole child wellness within the realm of sustainability and practices that promote a healthy lifestyle and a healthy earth.
Sorry, I can jump in here. I don't want to cut anyone off or anything, but I definitely echo what everyone else has been saying. I think from my perspective, one thing that I would like to highlight is the role of educators, given like my background with the climate initiative. And I think one of the reasons why we chose an approach that targets teachers is because for every student that we target, like they can go off into their career and feel inspired to do more. But we really want to do this on a large scale as possible. And so when you think about it, teachers are that necessary bottleneck or that necessary amplifier, and so to speak, because they're the ones who are interacting with at least like 20 students per classroom with however many classrooms every single day. And so throughout the span of that one teacher's career, they can touch thousands of people's minds and hearts. And so I think that that's one element as to why we think is specifically within the realm of education and making sure that climate education is equitable. We think that that's a great avenue. And honestly, I think teachers really don't get the appreciation that they truly deserve. So I just wanted to highlight that here.
Thank you, Angela. That was, yes, teachers are very much at the center of creating these connections and helping develop, as you all mentioned, capacity and building these connections and transforming education, which leads me into my next question for you all is, what do you see the current status of education in creating a positive climate future in terms of building these capacities in youth and building these connections for the local level, but for especially our youth activists that are working internationally, how you see it not only at the local level in Arizona where you're at, but internationally and nationally as well?
So I can be very honest that I'm very worried. I've been worried for a long time, but I think I'm a little bit more worried, especially recently when we keep hearing the narrative that the only thing that is important is the core subjects of school. And to that meaning just math and reading, and not a fundamental understanding that our students come to school wanting to learn and be there for a variety of things. I know just in my experiences teaching is that I had students who would only come to school for PE or only come to school for art and use that as a lever to be able to be engaged in other things. I know that right now, especially, a lot of our students are very much worried about the climate crisis. They are concerned of what's going to happen next, whether or not even going to higher education is worth it, whether or not they're going to be able to have a family here in Arizona with the water issues that they're aware of. So this impending ability to not fix something is not healthy, right? So to take these topics or these issues away and only focus in on the same, we need to go back to just reading and writing. We have forgotten that is limiting our students' ability to not only express themselves, but actually feel as if they're part of a solution to what's happening around them. I was sharing with my former student that was here, Daniela, that, my son yesterday texted me, "Mom, I figured it all out. We just need to put solar panels on every school. It's going to help with everything," right? And this is, and before I start thinking in the back of my head, there's policy, there's companies, there's tax write-offs, there's all these other things that are probably in his way. I want him to sit in this space where he feels like he has an answer and that he might be able to fix it. And how do other educators and administrators and students gather around together and say, maybe without these barriers that we've put up, there is a solution with the appropriate skills that other teachers can be part of, so that these students feel like they can change the world. It's actually possible, instead of saying, no, we can't do that. No, we can't do that. There's just, so started going back to it. I'm a little bit worried with just the narrative that a lot of this is not necessary. and we are taking away opportunities for real change that could impact future generations.
Marisol, I'm so glad that you talked about your worries, because we have a generation of teachers, and now some of the folks who are going into leadership, they've only known No Child Left Behind measures, right? So they've only experienced that heavy focus, especially in the elementary grades, K-5, on language arts and math. And yet there are so many other important subject areas that students need in order to thrive and in order to grow in our world. And you think about the importance of science and social studies when you're talking about climate, right? And you think about the importance of artistic expression, whether that be through music or whether that be through some visual arts, or whether that be, through any other way of expressing themselves, through writing, through poetry, etc. It's all so important to the overall well-being of our students. And so many times we've been thinking about the academic well-being of students, or we've been thinking about the healthy, like physical health and well-being of students, but we've got to think about the mental health of our students too. And that all happens when teachers are focused on the whole child. That all happens when we as policymakers are looking at the time spent doing valuable things in school. And so the fact that you bring that up is really important, because it's something that we're trying to teach our new leaders, our prospective leaders of schools. But it's really challenging when all they know is what they've experienced. So I'm from the generation where I got to experience a little bit more, right? And so when you ask me to imagine, I can imagine a classroom with, a tree inside and a library on top of that tree, and with lots of really cool areas for kids to explore. When you ask our future leaders about their ideal classroom these days, they think of 4 walls and they think of desks and rows. And we're trying to help them to unlearn some of those things so that they can dream big again about what school can be and how important it is for kids to be able to express themselves and learn about things like composting, learn about energy usage, and think about solar. I learned about solar energy when I was in 5th grade, and I am really, really old, but I learned about that. And that's like the most memorable lesson that I ever had when I was a kid. We made hot dogs outside using solar energy. Teachers need to be able to find the time and find the support that they need from their leaders to be able to go back to those types of experiences for kids that really make a difference for them, and provide meaning not only for the time that they're in that particular grade, which for me, the solar ovens that we created were in 5th grade, but it's something that's stuck with me ever since.
I agree with the panelists. I think right now we're living in a very broken system when it comes to education around climate change. For me, I grew up in a very small town called Prescott, and I wasn't really educated about climate change. All I was taught about was that the earth was heating up, and that was it. And I stumbled upon this class in college called Global Change. I took it optionally, and that was the first time I was actually exposed to the climate crisis and how deeply of a crisis we're in, and how it's a huge emergency. And I was completely thrown off because my education had failed me in preparing me for this crisis. And I truly believe that we need to make climate change curriculum mandatory. I know New Jersey 2 years ago, they passed this law where every single school from K to 12 needs to educate students about climate change, not just in science classes, but in every class, including art classes. I know a few PE classes actually have integrated climate change curriculum in them, which is so fascinating and interesting. And I truly believe that we need to find ways to educate these young people about climate change before it's too late. I don't know if any of you have heard of the climate clock in New York, which counts down how much time we have left before climate change becomes irreversible. And we currently have 7 years left, 7 years until 2030. Imagine how many kids will be graduating from high school and going out into the world and facing this world. and knowing that climate change exists before they were taught about it truly. So I truly believe we need to learn how to teach children about climate change and also co-create curriculum with them. I know ASU is doing amazing with that. They're designing a master's degree around sustainability education, and they're inviting students to the table to create that curriculum and create those degrees, because students deserve to have a seat on the table in designing their education. So I think we have a lot of creative ways we can reimagine our education systems and find ways to teach every child about climate change before it's too late.
Thank you so much for everything that's been shared so far. I think that are sort of something that I was actually thinking about whenever people were sharing their experiences going through the educational system, because as we know it, the educational system is changing before our very eyes due to COVID and due to the rise of online learning. So I really encourage people to consider what that means for having a hands-on and adaptive education that can still accommodate the needs of students and engage them in ways that are fulfilling, whether that be through like virtual art projects. I think that there's a lot of potential for online education to lead to more access to things like virtual field trips or connecting with people who are established in these fields. And so I really encourage educators to look into those as opportunities to explore, but also recognizing that the burden doesn't just fall on educators to be the ones to individually craft these types of curriculums, because we already see high levels of burnout due to online schooling in these systems. And so it's also on the question of administration as to how we can support these educators and making sure that they can do their job and making sure that students feel like they are being heard as well. Because at the end of the day, like looking at me through a screen is probably going to be just like a bit less engaging, and that's the truth of it. And so how do we like knowing that, how do we adjust in order to ensure that people are still following along and able to feel the same sort of empowerment that they did when they were in the physical classroom, but also what are opportunities to learn outside of the classroom, right? Because like I personally think that like people are students for the entirety of their lives, and so what types of experiences can we connect to in their everyday lives that are maybe outside of the classroom that can illustrate the importance of the climate crisis and how we can all have a part in fixing it as well.
Thank you. And I'm going to pass this next question to Sayarchana and Angela to go ahead and tell us, what do youth need from education, educators, educational policymakers to become more empowered to advance climate action?
Youth need a seat on the table. Oftentimes, something I notice across my years of activism is a lot of decisions are made behind closed doors without young people being involved. And I truly believe that young people deserve the opportunity to decide and co-create their futures. When it comes to curriculum especially, I believe that young people need to actively design what education they want to receive from the universities, from their schools, and from their communities around them. Young people have so many creative ideas and they think outside of the box. And oftentimes they can be seen as incompetent sometimes by others because they don't necessarily have years of experience. But young people truly have ideas and they think outside of the system because they don't necessarily have years of experience inside of the broken system, meaning that they can revolutionize the system itself from the outside. I truly believe that young people, when given the platform to actively co-create their futures, can truly design a future that is inclusive for themselves and the communities around them. I love what ASU is doing, especially with including more young people in designing solutions around education. And something I hope to see, especially from policymaking, is inviting more young people into the rooms. I know in COP26, when I went, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, a lot of decisions were made without young people. The oldest politician I met was around 40 years old. And it's so heartbreaking because I truly believe that we need all ages on board contributing and talking about climate change. I know in the work I've done with Turn Around Cards, our youngest contributor is 6 years old, and they've contributed ideas around climate education and climate policy. And I think it truly reveals that any age, any person from any age in any community truly has ideas on how to heal this world. And all they need is to be believed in and seen and heard. And that's something I hope to see from education and from policymaking.
I love that, Sayarchana. I totally agree with all of that's been said. I think I can share a little bit of my experience as to what it might look like for youth to be involved at designing and co-creating an educational space, because I think I've been very fortunate to have a couple of opportunities to do that. And so I think every time the new school year passes or the semester is about to start and teachers are considering what's in their syllabus or what's in their lesson plans, that is an opportunity to reflect on the previous semester, not only individually, but with students who've taken the class, right? And because I think it's very common to have like feedback forms, especially at the university level, about like what the class has been like. But like, why don't we just add to that and take that a step further so that we can gather the input of what students feel like is missing or what we can change, because these students are the ones who also go on to be things like course assistants and teaching fellows. And so I think that if we can trust youth to be in those roles as educators, then we should also feel comfortable trusting them to also be the ones partially designing the exact curriculum that they're trying to receive, right? Because I think one of the like deepest problems of education, especially at the secondary level, is that youth are considered like very much like kids, like they're not agentic, but really they're the ones who are taking control of their education. They choose whether or not to pay attention, right? And so I think that they do really have the capacity to indicate what they have interest in. And especially when you make education localized and you can very explicitly draw the lines between like climate change and what's happening in one's own community, people will pay attention. They'll show up and they do care. And I think that you can see this because youth are right now frustrated that there's no academic setting in which they can like pursue these types of goals. And that's why there's things like strikes and protests and like literally leaving the school system in order to do that, right? And so how do we channel that energy in a way that is more productive in the learning environment is, I think, the question that needs to be answered. And I think that one way of doing that is you already have a lot of these structures in place, like committees that are designed to talk about things like, oh, like how do we respond to ChatGPT? How do we respond to the climate crisis and snow days, etc.? And so I think that that's where like I totally emphasize with what Sayarchana is saying about having a seat at the table and not just having one or two youth, but having like a democratically representative sample of who is actually the ones receiving the education.
And to go off of that for Marisol and Joetta, what is your response as people working in the educational field, working with students, working with youth? There's this demand to have a seat at the table, to be involved. How does that happen? What are the starting steps? How do we see this eventual future where there's intergenerational collaboration in developing education?
I hate that I have to like be negative a little bit. But negative spaces, I agree with you guys 100%. I also want a seat at the table. So this is kind of a larger conversation, I think, is that a lot of these policies and issues, curriculum, educators are not even at the table when we're talking about K-12, right? A lot of times the standards are not developed by educators, but by policymakers who are sometimes critical of what we are able to do. So I'm going to go back to my student who left, but an example is that she's studying 2 languages, Spanish and Italian. And so she said, you know, the high school I went to, it only offered Spanish. So I'm behind, like I'm behind a lot of other students from other states who have come here and have that experience. And I said, well, didn't it ever seem odd to you that, you know, I was never able to speak Spanish to you in class? Because there are laws on the books that say I'm not allowed to speak Spanish to my students. So a lot of the issues that I think the youth feel are the same that the educators feel. So I think instead of not necessarily getting a seat at the table, but we create our own table in which we're the ones pulling and creating what needs to happen. And that table becomes so powerful that the other folks that are in power are actually going to want to be at it. We've seen that happen in different spaces, right? When we elect maybe a school board that, you know, that wants to work with educators, or new people in government who want to work with folks, people in the governor's office, people at the White House who want us at the table, that allows us to say, oh, we get to create a new table and maybe not invite the same people that have been there for years and for decades and have controlled what's happening in schools, but actually have some visionaries at the table, have the practitioners at the table, the researchers at the table. Those are the folks that should be creating these, these spaces and having these conversations. And it is frustrating for me as somebody who works with policymakers consistently, who very rarely want to hear not only from students, but they also don't even want to hear from the educators who are delivering the instruction. Does this even make sense? It's taken years for me to be able to sit at a table to talk about these things. And that comes from years of organizing. So I guess my conversation would be like, ladies, let's work together and create our own table. And then we will invite them after we're ready to go. And so that we can imagine what we want collectively, because I think amongst the two groups, we outnumber the policymakers.
I think it's important to be unapologetically persistent as well. So finding like-minded people, like Marisol was talking about, whether that be teachers and students or just a group of students, maybe students and family members who all want and believe in the same things, and then taking the democratic process by its strings and following up. So for example, a group of kids, a group of young adults getting together and going to the school board and saying, what is your policy on sustainable buildings? What's your policy on food distribution and food reuse? What's your policy on clean energy and electric buses? And helping them realize that perhaps they need to create a policy if they don't already have one. What's your policy on art instruction? Is it something that happens at the end of the day if there's time, or at the end of the week if there's time, once a month if there's time? Or do students have a curricula that they are exposed to on a regular basis, learning about all kinds of great artists and art techniques so that they can express themselves? You have to get involved. I can tell you, most superintendents want to hear from kids. They have an advisory board. They want their kids to tell them what's important to them. If these things are important to you, get involved and help the people who are leading the schools, the school systems, and the policymakers understand what's important to you.
Yeah, and to go with the point, I agree, making your own table, having these discussions and coming as a collected force, as going to the superintendents, going to the policymakers, this chain. And for each of you, a final question before we pass it to the audience. What is your vision for the future of a world where policymaking is accessible to everyone? They're able to share their voice, they're able to share their visions with those who have the power to create these changes, and uplifting communities that are often unheard, including Indigenous voices, marginalized communities, making sure those voices are part of the conversation beyond just youth.
Well, I can speak a little bit about what it looks like maybe for my generation and the ability to hopefully model it. And as youth come up, is that starting everything with a clear racial kind of and social and climate justice lens. Every meeting, every time that a policy is brought up, anytime somebody thinks of a solution, going backwards and thinking, who are those that are most harmed? Who are those that are not in this room? How do we include them in this room? A couple hours ago, I was down at the legislature to talk specifically about a policy piece that to me just really felt just layered with racism and sexism and misogyny and bigotry. And I just tried it with people whom I thought were really on the right path. But what I try to do is stop and say, how come the community who is most at risk here is not in the room? How can we have this conversation without sharing their story first as the why before we try to figure out what the solution is? I think that if we have current folks that are activists, which since I don't work for a school board anymore or school district anymore, I'm allowed to be an activist and be out front and modeling that type of behavior. I'm hoping that it will become just so natural, right, to the next generation who are going to be in those rooms at those tables to say we start here and then we go backwards. And I think that is a really important first step, at least for me.
I grew up in a mining community here in Arizona, about an hour and a half away. And one of the things that I can vividly remember is walking to school and tasting arsenic on that walk as I breathed in. And my vision for the future is that no children have to taste arsenic when they're walking to school. My vision for the future is ensuring that students know that they have a voice at the table and that they have the curriculum that helps them understand their role in keeping the state, their community, the places where they hike, the places where they live, the places where they spend their time doing leisure activities, that those places are clean and safe because they contributed and they understand their role in helping other people embrace strategies that keep the world clean and safe. I think it really does involve people coming together, finding that common ground and pushing for clean, sustainable, a clean, sustainable climate that's going to be enriching for all students. And like Marisol said, having the right people, the people who are most impacted, invited to the table and feeling like they have a voice is really, really important. So what is our responsibility as folks who are here at the university, as folks who have agency, as folks who might be activists in enlisting folks from Indigenous communities, folks from communities where there's a lot of pollution or a lot of lead in the ground and in the walls of the homes that they're living in, helping them understand what's happening to them so that they can take an active role as well.
I first off just wanted to say it's so heartbreaking that you had to go through that in childhood. And it's also so heartbreaking that so many children go through that every single day, and that's their living reality. When I think about climate change and I think about who's most impacted by climate change, I think about BIPOC communities, Indigenous communities, and people in poverty. Yet when we look at the people sitting on these decision-making tables, who are they? Most of them are people who come from backgrounds where their families made a lot of money. Most of them are white men, and it's so heartbreaking seeing that disparity between the communities most impacted by climate change and the communities making decisions about the future about climate change every single day. I truly believe we need to bridge that gap in these communities by giving these vulnerable and often underrepresented communities seats on the table, and also creating tables like you mentioned. I currently work on the Advisory Council for United Nations Ocean Decade. This advisory council is built with young people around the US. There's around 27 of us, and we work in basically advising Congress members on policies around climate change. And advisory councils like that are amazing, but we should not just stop there because they also only consist of a few people that often have the privilege of finding out about these opportunities and have the time to apply to them. I think we also need to do outreach into communities and do community building events to make sure that these politicians don't just make decisions in fancy rooms with air conditioning, but actually are actively co-creating policy in the communities deeply impacted by climate change. And that's just on a local level. On a global level, I believe that communities such as especially countries from the global south are very unheard in climate negotiations. When I was at COP26 in 2021, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, most of the politicians there were from the global north. And that's so heartbreaking considering that most of the countries that experience the most climate disasters are from the global south, yet they do not have the funds or the ability to travel to these very fancy United Nations conferences where actual climate policies and treaties are being built. So I believe that we need to add more funding to make sure that these representatives can be sent to these conferences. We need to make sure that the demographic of the leaders are truly reflective of the communities that they're leading. And we don't need to just build advisory councils. We need to invite these people to co-create policies. We don't just need them to advise these policymakers. We need them to be the policymakers. And in order for them to be the policymakers, we need to educate them and give them the opportunity to. And we don't just need to educate the young people, because climate change does not just affect the young people, like you mentioned. So finding ways to empower these communities and give them policymaking roles is so important. I know my colleague, Kevin J. Patel, he currently is based in LA, and he founded a youth climate commission that helps co-create policies with LA policymakers. And I think that's so incredible. He literally created a table for people who are misrepresented, underrepresented. And I think we all have the ability to create tables too. And on a policy level, we need more funding, we need more education, and we truly need more empathy, because we need more people to be seen. And often the communities that are the most impacted are the most invisible. And that's one of the greatest injustices when it comes to policymaking. And that's something I truly hope to see change.
I'm definitely so inspired by the work of others like Kevin, like you, and all of the others who are just here listening to like ways that we can all brainstorm and be together and work together on this issue. One thing that I'd like to add is on the question of what representation looks like. I think that there's often a trend towards having consultations of different manners, like with youth, with like underrepresented communities. I think at the like even national level and the environmental justice councils, there's opportunities to engage and have community-based conversations. But I don't think that this is enough, in the sense that oftentimes we have these consultations, people express what they've expressed again and again before, and then nothing happens, right? And so there's this disconnect between what is being said and what is being done. And I think that that's one of the most frustrating parts, because these people are giving a lot of their time and energy and knowledge to ensuring that we can make a difference, and it's just not following through. So I think that there is also an element of ensuring accountability. I'd like politicians and other types of decision makers to actually explain to us what exactly inspired them from the consultations to take the actions that they did, right? Because it's easy for them to say that they surveyed a number of people and that this is the result that they came to, but what exactly from that is like meaningful to them? Like, how do they feel that they are now invested in the community? How have they engaged the community in making sure that the decision is equitable and is beneficial to those who are affected? These are the types of questions that I think need to be answered before making any sort of large scale decision that affects communities that are not like your own. And so I think that that's one way, especially in the youth community, where we can do better in terms of ensuring representation.
Thank you. And I think you all just really touched on the importance of collaborating and supporting each other through this process of getting this representation from an intergenerational and a socioeconomic perspective. And to continue this conversation and bringing it to our audience, I want to ask you all a similar question of, what is your vision? Our amazing panelists have very much highlighted how the mechanisms of art, education, policymaking can advance efforts for creating a sustainable climate future for all. And I want to know what your guys' visions are, if you can share that with us and potentially work with our wonderful panelists here to envision how we can make that happen. So anyone would like to go? We have Anne to pass around a mic.
I have a question, but it's not necessarily like I don't know what to envision. It's more about, how do I find out about the good climate change news? I feel like the way I see it is on Instagram randomly, or I follow Turn It Around cards, but is there like a consistent place to find good climate news change, or like how people are addressing solutions?
A question. I feel like climate change can sometimes feel like a very depressing topic to think about, and we definitely need more optimism. For me, I find a lot of hope in connecting with community organizers because climate change news isn't just online, it's also present in our community and actively around us. There's so many amazing organizers and community members creating and envisioning change. So for me, connecting with community members is definitely a source of optimistic climate change news for me. Additionally, there's a lot of different news outlets out there that focus on positive climate change news. I know there's a podcast out there called Green New Dreamer, I think, and it focuses on kind of like the positive wins of climate change. And I know also on TikTok, there's something called Eco Talk, where there's a whole side of TikTok that focuses on climate change positivity. So there's a lot of amazing climate change scientists on that platform talking about the wins. And I know additionally, there's a lot of books out there around climate change optimism. I know Jane Goodall wrote a book about hope. And I know there's a lot of books out there about hope too. So definitely digging in, doing some research, and also communicating with people on the ground doing climate change activism is really important. For me, when I sometimes get discouraged, I connect with people doing work. I know, for example, Lizzie has given me a lot of hope. And having conversations like that and connecting with people who do the work is also really helpful in finding optimism.
I also have more of a question than a vision, but I've just really taken with what the teachers have been sharing. And so I have a question for the teachers, because I find the position of being an educator, like I was a teacher, I've been a teacher, this space of translation between policy and the students and that you've been talking about. And especially when policy takes 15 years or something to make, or sometimes it's in retrograde and is, focusing on numeracy and literacy at the expense of other things. And yet you have students walking into your classroom experiencing heat vulnerability or arsenic in the air, as you described, or like really immediate, we have our climate anxiety, but also like I can't sleep. My house is so hot and I can't breathe the air, or we had to move, or, like we're increasingly facing these climate impacts, direct impacts on our students. And yet, to what extent is there space for that in the curriculum that you have? And then how are you as teachers addressing that space, like finding flexibility within it, around it, between it, like there's the fighting back we need to do at the policymakers, and I'm with you and I'm working on it too. But also there's like this creativity happening on the ground in the classroom where you're doing it. Can you share a little bit about what that's like the tensions that you feel or the creative spaces that you find, not educating about climate change, but addressing it like in the lived experiences of your classes?
So I can speak a little bit about just the ebb and flow of just going into a classroom and knowing what is going on and trying to be as real as possible. It is, even before COVID, but amplified times 3 with COVID, is the amount of responsibilities that are leaped on our shoulders. And I think this is where we're able to kind of connect because, as an administrator and as a principal, having an administrator and a leader of the school that kind of says, let me take a lot of the stuff that is outside noise away so you can really focus in on your craft and connect with your students alleviates a lot of that pressure and anxiety that our students walk in with, right? I always, where I worked in my school district, a lot of the students didn't have air conditioning nor heat. And so they would be at the school before I would get there and they wouldn't leave until I left just because they had a safe, cool or warm place. There was food there. It was a comforting space. So when I had leadership in my in my site who would say, don't worry about this mandate or this conversation, but you can actually connect with your kids and make them feel. That is when I was able to do my very best teaching. That is when I was able to say what was important to this child that I can tomorrow change the lesson and we can go deeper into what they care about, alleviate their anxiety about what's happening outside just for this 55 minutes so that I can connect with them and they can have a memorable experience and feel safe. And I'll go back to my question a couple minutes ago. It's very difficult currently, especially over the last 4 years, the amount of attacks and public policy that is being focused in on stopping me from being able to do that. On every level, on a school board level, to a statewide level, on a national level, the consistent attacks of these folks who are practitioners of the common good, yet are not paid equitably, our workforce that are not treated fairly or exploited. And yet they're the ones who are going to be able to probably be that leverage for a lot of those students to feel comfortable and safe and alleviate some of those anxieties to then come to places like this and research more and actually change and fix things. So it's a roundabout way of saying we need as many people as possible's help to push these policymakers to take 2 steps back and let the professionals just do their job, right? Because every moment that I can spend with a child who wants to talk to me about something that's important and they feel safe, that's a year of academics that I could give them. That is being stripped away daily. I mean daily, especially in this state. Daily am I being, is our profession under attack? So I think that for me as an educator in Phoenix, seeing the reality of what the climate is doing to my students and their community, I would just need time to be able to be with them and talk with them and be a great professional. And unfortunately, it does come back to politics and democracy and voting, and not just voting, to Angela's point, but holding folks accountable who are not doing what they said, and being part of a movement to make sure the right people are elected who are doing stuff. And if they're not, then get them out and get new people in. So it's a really powerful place to be an educator, but it also is becoming increasingly frustrating that you can't do your job and what you know is right for kids.
And I want to say that a lot of the policy that's being enacted at the state level has been force-fed upon educators from a place of fear, right? So they think educators are doing all of these really radical things in their classrooms. But I know the reality. And the reality is our teachers and our principals who have the strongest connections with students, they have great relationships with the kids, great relationships with their families. They're able to work within those margins of exemption. They're able to figure out, okay, so maybe I'm not going to use the word climate change, but we're going to talk about the weather and the trends in the weather every single day and what impact that has on kids in their homes, and whether it's too hot or whether it's too cold. We're going to talk about what impact that has on the fires that are happening, you know, the forest fires or the desert fires or wherever those are, the floods that have been occurring, the earthquakes, the tornadoes, you name it. We're going to talk about all of those things. We're also going to talk about the fact that we've got lots and lots of vehicles that come in different shapes, sizes, and different makes, right? And again, we're not talking climate change, but we're talking about something that's clean energy, good for the earth. And what I would tell teachers and what I would tell principals, what I would tell any district official or director is you have to do what's right for kids. And you have to do what you know is best in order to promote their total well-being. And so sometimes you just work. You work the system, you work the relationships, you work it out so that you're doing what's right and what's good.
Thank you all. As I'm sitting here, I'm not a teacher. I'm not in a classroom. But there are things that I would like to do. How could I support teachers and students and help create a more equitable climate education in schools if I'm not in there?
So there's a couple of things that come out that I love this. One, go to your local school board meeting, local governing board meeting. They're every other week. They're in the evening. They're accessible. Most of them are still on Zoom. I think that you can probably watch on Zoom. The school districts are being inundated by people who do not live in that community and who are bringing things forward from outside of even the state, like they're traveling around. So as a community member, they work for you, right? That the school boards are elected and their job is to represent the community. So that is the first thing. For me, it's the easiest thing ever is to show up at at your community school and ask them what they need. How can you can support them. There are amazing organizations that a lot of schools work with, especially on climate justice, including CHISPA is an organization here in Arizona we work a lot with, which again is based in equity and conservation voters, but democracy, getting people voted, getting people registered to vote, making sure they turn out, making sure they have issues, and more importantly, they have done work that is sustainable. So their work most recently was the clean buses in Phoenix Union that was led by students. And so they supported. So, when people say, where should we donate? CHISPA, work with them. They're doing real good work in not just urban areas, but indigenous areas. So, I mean, those are the first three things that I can think of. There's amazing organizers who are doing the work and have always done the work and work directly with youth. School boards, if it is, they don't get paid. It's a hard job. But if people have time, run for school board. I mean, we need people on there with this type of view, of futuristic view. There are students running for school board, which is awesome. We had an ASU student run here in Mesa and we got behind him, the union, we walked for him and called for him. We're trying to lower the age for people to run for the legislature to 18 this year. There's a bill. Of course, people are going to push back. Why? Because they have inventive, creative, new ideas. So things like that, those pushing the current policymakers to do the right thing and focus them, hold them accountable, and then vote them out if they're not going to follow through.
Good to see two young folks in the stage. We met in New York. You guys are amazing. My question to just to know that how the US curriculum is teaching climate change for the school kids. Of course, it's not climate change. I totally agree that it's global warming. It's hot and cold. It's fire. I have done some little tiny works on this thing. Like what I feel that introducing circular economy, 3R, the concept of 3R. At the very elementary level is very effective. I can remember that during our school days, we used to learn about raising awareness, was not, want not. So this thing is totally gone from our curricula these days in Bangladesh. I'm from Bangladesh. And interestingly, how to learn computer, what is computer, it has taken place of this awareness thing. So what I believe that introducing the concept of circular economy, that reduce, reuse, and recycle is the best way to teach the children and to get educated youth. And what makes me sad, I will conclude here. What makes me sad in the US, I see that every one of us, each of us who are present here is traveling, holding a plastic mug, plastic cup in the morning, in the evening, in the lunch, in the dinner. So how we are going to change this? So this is a pretty massive challenge. Thank you.
If I could, one of the things that I do see in schools is teachers talking about carbon footprints. And so again, they're not using the word global warming or climate change, but they are talking about that concept of this footprint and how much trash a person might use, how much energy a person might use, and how that accumulates day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year, and where it all goes, right? And I think that is one thing that our teachers have felt safe to talk about is the carbon footprint, the pollution problem, and what students and their families can do to help reduce that carbon footprint. Thank you for your point. It was a really good one.
Yeah, I have a question that is also related to that, especially sensitizing the youth. And here I'm thinking of the youth in the global South who don't have like the privilege to like access to Instagram, TikTok, or even if you send a link, they won't have maybe access to internet wherever they are. but they maybe they've been displaced because of racing lakes, or maybe they have lost their livelihoods due to extended drought. They are experiencing this, but I'm just wondering, what can you propose to be done to just sensitize them and prepare them for climate change?
Definitely. I think you bring up a very important point and also a heartbreaking point that a lot of these very vulnerable and impacted communities in Global South don't have the resources around, for example, internet, social media, and a lot of the times, a lot of climate change education, at least, but from what I've learned, because my education as a child didn't teach me about climate change, was learned from the internet. So I guess like some ways we can kind of like examine and imagine ways we can engage these youth in the Global South is actively working with these leaders and policymakers in developing programs that engage these young people, because you don't need to learn about climate change just through the internet. You can also learn about climate change by developing programs in these schools that engage young people in building solutions. I believe that one of the best ways to educate young people about climate change solutions is to give them the opportunity to build the solutions and learn about it through building it. For me, I learned the most about climate change by working on projects that were building solutions. And when I was traveling and meeting all these different people from especially the Global South, they told me that some of the ways they learned the most about climate change was through building community organizations and programs that educated them about climate change. And also members of parliament and ministers of education from the Global South especially are trying to create more climate change curriculum, and they're trying to build programs. And you also brought up the point about refugees and how climate change is displacing refugees, especially in the Global South. And I think being able to build programs that educate them about climate change and also support them in kind of the trauma that they go through is really important, because when you're educating people in the Global South, they're not just learning about climate change, they're experiencing it every day. So being able to support them mentally and emotionally while they learn about the crisis that they're living in is something that's really important. But there's a lot of amazing organizations on the ground doing that. I know Fridays for the Future is building educational programs with different countries. I know there's a lot of local NGOs in the Global South working on climate education. And I know there's a lot of also tech companies trying to increase access to internet. So it's a very nuanced approach, and like there's a lot of different moving pieces and contributing to the change. But I think the main kind of like way we can do it is engaging local organizations and NGOs and creating climate education tools.
To all of our panelists for just sharing your experiences and your knowledge with all of us. And thank you for your questions in the audience. But I think we'll wrap up here. So thank you again. And if we could get a round of applause for amazing panelists. And just to close, keep the conversation going. Discuss how you can use art if you're an artist, if you're a youth, if you're an educator, if you're just interested in trying to participate in climate action, get involved, have these conversations, and just keep the momentum going. So thank you, everyone.